Is this the clicker, you think? Where is the clicker? You got it right there? Should be one down here. So little Johnny was at school. It was a Monday. He couldn't find the clicker either. Teacher wanted to know what the kids did over the weekend. And little Johnny said, well, we went fishing. Teacher said, yeah. How'd you do? Now, little Johnny was prone to what you might say exaggeration sometimes. And little Johnny said, well, we did great, caught 100 fish. She said, you caught 100 fish? He said, yeah, we caught 100 fish. She said, well, that's a lot. Are you sure you caught 100 fish? She said, yes, ma'am, caught 100 fish. She said, really? Well, how big were they? He said, they were huge, really big. He said, well, how big were they? The teacher asked him, how big were they? And he said, well, they weighed 100 pounds apiece. She said, John, they didn't weigh no 100 pounds apiece. There's no way you caught 100 fish that weighed 100 pounds apiece. He said, yes, ma'am. We caught 100 fish and they weighed 100 pounds apiece. She said, Johnny, that's 10,000 pounds. You don't have a boat that would hold 10,000 pounds. That did not happen. You are exaggerating. In fact, that's nigh unto a lie. Little Johnny said, no, ma'am. We got 100 fish, weighed 100 pounds apiece. She said, little Johnny, what if I just made up stuff? Something like I'm on my way to school, and as I'm driving my little Toyota Corolla, a huge 10-foot tall grizzly bear jumps out of the woods, gets in front of my car, starts shaking it, is trying to get in, but all of a sudden this little 2-pound chihuahua comes running from the other side of the road, jumps up and grabs that bear by the nose, flips him over, beats him up, and chases him off. Would you believe that? Little Johnny said, yes, ma'am. That's my dog. Well, we hope not to exaggerate anything this morning like little Johnny might sometimes. Alleged contradictions. If you were to ask the skeptical community what is the strongest argument they have against the Bible, they are going to quickly tell you that the Bible contains errors, and most importantly, they're going to say it contains contradictions. A contradiction is when one author writes something and another author writes something different, and the two cannot be reconciled. And the skeptical community is going to say that there are so many hundreds of these that you as a Christian should never accept what the Bible says because it is so full of contradictory information. If you were to listen to the skeptics as they say these types of things, Dan Barker says people who are free of theological bias notice that the Bible contains hundreds of discrepancies. The Bible is a flawed book. Now, several years ago, in 2009, going on 10 years ago now, I debated Dan Barker on the campus of the University of South Carolina. He's the co-president still of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the largest unbelieving group in the United States to my knowledge. I think they've got about 25,000 members that are registered paid members. Now, in the debate, we were debating the idea, the proposition, the God of the Bible exists. And that's what I was affirming, the God of the Bible exists. He was denying that the God of the Bible exists. In your first opening speech, you get 10 minutes. Out of his first opening speech, of the 15, you get 15 minutes. Out of his 15 minutes of his first opening speech to deny that the God of the Bible exists, he spent approximately 10 minutes listing alleged Bible contradictions. He said, well, the God of the Bible can't exist because the Bible says this here and it says this over here. The God of the Bible can't exist because it says this here and it says this over here. Now, I frame the statement that way for this reason. Dan Barker is the president of the largest unbelieving organization in North America. He has been in more moderated debates than any unbeliever to date. I think it's upwards of about 120 of them now. And in his first opening statement, where you're supposed to put the strongest information you've got, he spends about 2/3 of it using the argument that the God of the Bible can't exist because the Bible contains so many contradictions. So I would then ask, do you think that the skeptical community believes that this is a pretty strong argument against not only the Bible but even the God of the Bible? Well, certainly the skeptical community does. As you continue to look at statements they make, Steve Wells wrote a book called The Skeptic's Annotated Bible. If you were to look at this particular Bible, it's like a study Bible. It's just for the skeptic, and they go through and he puts, well, this contradicts this, etc. And he says the Bible's unworthy of belief. Dennis McKenzie in the Encyclopedia of Biblical Errancy says every analyst of the Bible should realize that the book is a veritable miasma of contradictions, inconsistencies, inaccuracies, poor science, bad math, inaccurate geography, immoralities, degenerate heroes, childish superstitions, silly miracles, and dry as dust discourse. But contradictions remain the most obvious, the most potent, the most easily proven, and the most common problem to plague the book. So he says the Bible's got all kinds of problems. But he says the biggest one that you can see the easiest is this idea of a contradiction. That Matthew will say something and then Mark will say something else, and the two statements just simply cannot be reconciled. This is one of the greatest challenges. When I say greatest, let me change that to the most often used challenges that we hear at our I wonder if my battery is going out there. Let's see. No? Full battery. So, we say all that to say, this is a very needed topic and it's a very serious discussion. As you start to see the effects of what this alleged contradiction argument can do, several years ago, we had a preacher contact us and say, hey, I need your help. We had a young man from this congregation, he said, who enrolled in a class about an hour away from here at a state school. It was just a junior college, but the class was comparative religions. And in that particular class, the professor stood up and said, I am going to spend this semester showing any of you who think that the God of the Bible exists, that your faith is wrong, and that the Bible is so full of errors that it is not worthy of belief at all. And he passed out a packet of 5 pages of what he called 70 factual discrepancies in the Bible. And so for the course of that semester, periodically he would pull that out and he would go through these 70 factual discrepancies. That young man who grew up in the Lord's church and by all accounts from everybody that knew him was a strong Christian, they thought, when he left at age 17 after that single class one semester. Came back home armed with that 5-page packet and in essence threw it on the desk of that preacher and said, I never knew there were contradictions in the Bible. I don't believe in Christianity anymore. And the preacher said, can you help me answer these? And so for the next couple weeks at Apologetics Press, we provided answers for all 70 of those alleged factual discrepancies. They weren't even really all that hard to answer. What I'm telling you, though, is if a person goes into this discussion not having had any background or critical thinking on it, it can be challenging. In fact, the Proverbs writer says the person who pleads his case first seems right until his neighbor comes and answers him. But what happens lots of times is a young high school student who is first semester in college sits down and has always been told that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, but has never really looked at it and considered it real closely. And that professor gets up and says, well, this contradicts this and this contradicts this. And they throw so many of them at this young person at once that they don't really know what to do with him. So as we start looking at these ideas, I'm going to do this for you. In that packet of 70 factual discrepancies, the ones that you're going to work through with me are 3 of those. Now, I say 3 of those because we could do this to all 70, but of course we won't have time in this class period. But here's how I always start this discussion. If someone were to say, in fact, as you look at the challenge to the Bible, how many factual discrepancies or contradictions would a person need to disprove that the Bible is the inspired Word of God? 1. 1 would do it. And so is it odd to you that the claim is not that there's 1, but that there's hundreds? You see, because if there really were just 1 legitimate contradiction between Matthew and Mark, or Matthew and Luke, or Luke and Acts, etc., then that would solve the skeptical problem of disproving the biblical inspiration. You don't need hundreds. So before we go further, why do you think that the claim is that there are hundreds? I'm going to tell you why, but before I do, formulate an answer in your mind. I was in Arkansas. I was doing a creation evolution seminar and stood up, delivered my stuff on just on the existence of God. It was creation evolution material, did the existence of God. A young man came up to me afterward. It looked like he was about, I'm going to say 20 years old or so. I had this 3-ring binder. Came up to me and with this little, kind of a condescending smirk on his face. He said, well, I know what you're saying about there being an existence of God, about God existing, but he said, you got to admit the Bible's full of errors. And I said, well, no, I don't have to admit that. In fact, I've never seen one. Could you show me one? He said, oh, yeah, there's hundreds of them. I said, okay, could you show me one? He opens his 3-ring binder and puts into my face, just holds it out in front of me. He says, yeah, here's a page that's got hundreds of them on it. I said, wow, it looked like it was about 3.2 font. Tiniest little font, you could hardly even read it. I bent down to look at it. He says, so many that the Bible's obviously full of mistakes. I said, that's interesting. I said, which one of those do you think is the strongest? He said, well, I hadn't looked at any one of them particularly. There are just so many of them. I said, so you haven't really looked to see if any one of those is a real mistake or error. You're just saying that, well, he said, yeah, there's just so many of them that some of them got to be. Okay, now here's what we're going to do. We're going to have to make sure that one of them is a legitimate contradiction before we say any of them is. And what you're going to find out is, after someone presents you with their strongest one, well, if they present you with their strongest one and you answer that, what's going to happen? What you like to think would happen is a person would rationally consider, oh, that was my strongest one, and you just answer that, so anyone that comes after that is going to be less strong. But what happens, generally speaking, is when someone presents you with an alleged contradiction and you say, okay, let's look at that, and you answer it, almost before taking another breath, they say, yeah, but what about this one? And then you answer that. They say, yeah, but what about this one? And they think by giving you so many, even though none of them is a legitimate contradiction, they think by giving you so many, they've somehow won the argument. Now, let's see how that works. A grocer is selling ribs for 50 cents a pound. Well, the line out the door to buy ribs at his grocery store is, it's long. People have heard about this. He's having to get new ribs in all the time. Somebody comes in and says, man, you got the cheapest ribs in town. How you do it? He said, well, I sell them for 50 cents a pound. They said, I know you sell them for 50 cents a pound, but nobody else can sell them for that. What do you buy them for? He said, well, I buy them for 55 cents a pound. They say, you buy them for 55 cents a pound and you sell them for 50 cents a pound? You're losing a nickel on every pound. He said, yeah, but we're selling so many hundreds of pounds, pretty soon we're going to get rich. Well, something just doesn't give there, does it? You're not going to make up in volume what you lose per pound. Now, here's what we mean by that. If not a single contradiction actually is a contradiction, then it doesn't matter how many hundreds that people claim are contradictions. If individually they're not, then collectively there's no argument. And so, before I get involved in any discussion on alleged contradictions, what I always ask the person who's challenging me on this is, okay, there are hundreds of these. Give me your strongest. And what we've tried to do is take the strongest ones that are most often used from the skeptical community and present them to you. Now, I find it very interesting that I just put out a video. It's a little YouTube video that it's about a 5-minute video on alleged contradictions. And this atheist, who is a fairly well-known YouTube personality, analyzes and sends a rebuttal out of my video. And here's what he says. He says, yeah, well, Kyle answered those 3, but nobody in the skeptical community actually uses those 3. Here's 3 he can't answer. Well, those happen to be, the ones that I answered happen to be 3 of the most often used discrepancies in any writing or videos ever. Now, what if I then go to the 3 that he presented me and answer those? What's going to happen? Well, the next atheist is going to say, well, nobody really uses those. Here's the real 3 you can't answer. Well, then here's the real 3 you can't answer. Okay, so hold on just a second. Hold. Give me the best one you got. And as they do that, these are the ones that come to the surface with the best that they have. And at first, if you haven't really thought through it, you think, well, that does sound kind of contradictory, but let's work through this. This probably has never given you pause at all. Jesus, talking about the resurrected Christ, he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. So according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 5, who saw Jesus' resurrected body? Peter, Cephas, Simon, his 3 names, and then by the 12 apostles. And so if you were just to write down who saw Jesus, Peter and the 12 apostles. Well, but then as you go to Acts, you start to read that statement in 1 Corinthians, according to the skeptic, is contradictory to what you read in Acts, because in Acts, in Matthew, Judas threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and hanged himself, and Matthias was numbered with the 11 apostles after Jesus' ascension to heaven. And so, here's what the skeptic says. If he was seen by Peter and then the 12, but then the Bible says that Judas is already dead, he couldn't have been seen by the 12, and so that's a contradiction. There you go. You ever thought about that? Let's say you're a student, you've never thought about that, and a professor throws that out to you and calls you on the carpet because they know you're a Christian, and that professor says, you're a Christian, aren't you? Give me an answer to this. What happens there? Well, some of this stuff you can't come up with on the spur of the moment thinking through. In fact, your best approach would be, appreciate you calling me. Yes, sir, I am a Christian. Let me do a little research on that and get back to you next class period. What could he say with that? You see, what happens is, if you don't think through this stuff or haven't seen a fairly simple answer to it, it just at first sounds a little confusing. You know, it's kind of like the old saying, what is stronger than God? Nothing. What am I holding in my hand? Nothing. So what I'm holding in my hand is stronger than God. Well, you know that's not right, but technically analyzing what it is about that statement that makes it not right, well, it takes a little thought. It's like those little metal puzzles that you know there's a way to get that one off of the 2 little round things, but it takes a little while to work through it. So let's not pretend that, hey, this stuff isn't at first interesting, to say the least, and maybe even, okay, hold on, how does that work? But let's approach it like we would any other writing and give it the benefit of the doubt and see if there's a possibility that there's no contradiction here. And when you start looking at the possibility that there's no contradiction here, what you realize is there are multiple ways you could answer this particular alleged contradiction. Number 1, are numbers sometimes used as a name and not as the numeric value? Sure, happens all the time. In fact, Big Ten Conference. Big Ten Conference is a college conference in Division I. How many teams are in the Big Ten Conference right now? Anybody know? Anybody? 12? Well, then the person on ESPN that gets on and says this team is a member of the Big Ten Conference is a liar and contradicts himself because he says it's the Big Ten Conference and there's 12 teams. Is that right? No, because sometimes numbers are just used as names and not as numbers. Dollar General. How much is stuff in the Dollar General? Should be just $1 because it's called Dollar General. But it's not just $1, is it? In fact, I was down in Panama to do some teaching down there, and there's a store in Spanish. It's Todos a Dolor. Everything's $1. Like our Dollar General store, although this seemed a little more specific to me, where it says everything's $1. So I go in expecting everything to be $1. I pick something up, I'm like, I can't believe this is $1. $6.50. I said, look, the name of the store is everything's $1. Well, Apparently, the name of their store, Everything's a Dollar, is very much like our Dollar General. We might call it Dollar General, but that doesn't mean everything's a dollar. Now, a dollar is actually a numeric statement. It's 100 cents. But it doesn't necessarily carry any type of numeric value. As you start looking at that, big Atlantic 10 Conference, I think they got 12, 13, 14 teams. They shift and wane and wax sometimes, and they'll lose a team and pick up 2, etc. What about this one? 2x4. I was talking to a person in Birmingham, not far from here, and they said, we almost had a split over 2x4s. No pun intended. I just now got that. That's the person. So we had a lady come up to me. This guy was telling me the story. He said, I had a lady come up to me after one of my lessons. She said, we got a brother in this church that's cheating people. He said, you do? She said, yeah, we got to do something about it. She said, I ordered 80 2x4s from this brother who sells lumber in our congregation, and he dropped them off, and I went out there and I measured them. And they were not 2 inches by 4 inches. In fact, they were only 3 5/8 of an inch by 1 5/8 of an inch, and he's cheating people out of lumber. Well, the guy telling me this said he could hardly control a smile, and he tried to work with this lady and said, well, in the lumber world, anything that is 3 5/8 of an inch or better by 1 5/8 of an inch or better counts as a 2x4. 2x4 is not a technical term. It's just a numeric value that is now used as a name. And so, yeah, that's a legitimate 2x4. And if you go to another store, they're going to give you the exact same size of a 2x4. Now, if in a court document you were reading about someone who committed some type of crime and they hit somebody over the head with a 2x4, and the court witness said, so-and-so struck the man in the head with a 2x4. And the prosecution got up and said, that is a false witness because it was not exactly 2 inches by 4 inches. It was actually, well, what would be going on there? Nothing. Because 2x4 doesn't mean exactly 2 inches by 4 inches. It means a piece of wood that everybody recognizes this name talks about. Now, I'll tell you what else is very interesting. The Dirty Dozen. You remember the movie The Dirty Dozen? These guys were given the task of going into a very dangerous situation, but they were in prison anyway, and so if they lived through it, then they were going to get out of prison. Well, when one of them died, did they change the name to the Dirty 11? When 2 of them died, was it now the Tainted 10? I mean, anything like that? No. Okay, if one of them died, they would still be called members of the Dirty Dozen. Now, I'll tell you what's very interesting. In the book of Acts, when you read about the first, there in Acts chapter 6, those 7 men that were picked with Stephen and Philip being one of them. Later on, after Stephen dies, Philip is still called one of the 7. Why? Because it was a name that was given to this group, regardless of how many of them were still alive. And so after John was killed by Herod with the sword in Acts chapter 12, do you think they no longer called the rest of the apostles one of the 12? After Paul was added and there were 13, do you think they somehow changed it to the 13? They didn't. The 12 was just a simple technical term that did not carry a numeric value that was a name for Jesus' first original apostles. That's it. However, we've got another explanation besides that. And so here's the thing that you learn about alleged contradictions in the Bible. You don't have to know the exact answer. Because lots of times there could be 2, 3, 4, 5 different answers. You just have to show that there's a possibility that this is the case. And so it would be like, let's say somebody said that you committed a crime, and you said, no, I've got an alibi for that, and there was a video that showed you walking into your house. And there was a video that showed you 10 minutes later walking out of the house. Now, which rooms did you go in your house? It might be that you went into the kitchen, might be that you went into the living room. We might never know what room you went in the house, but the alibi of you being in the house with the video surveillance footage shows that you were there. So what we're doing with these alleged contradictions is saying, well, here's one possibility, here's another possibility. Sometimes there's 3 possibilities. We might not know exactly which one is it. It is, but they're all legitimate possibilities. Here's the next one. There's something that is called prolepsis. And that is when you give something a status that it has now, and you project the status back to a time it didn't have it. Now, it sounds like a real technical grammatical term, but you do it all the time. In fact, what if I were to say, let's say I had a picture of my wife and I put my wife's picture up there when she was 6 years old and she was riding her little bike in the neighborhood there in Birmingham, and I said, wasn't my wife so cute when she was 6 years old? Now, hold on just a second. Was she my wife when she was 6 years old? No, obviously we weren't married. When is she my wife? Right now. I'm taking her status as my wife now, and I'm projecting it back to a time when she wasn't my wife, and you all understand exactly what I'm talking about. It's prolepsis. We use it all the time. My wife when she was 6. Look how cute she was. That's what we would say, although she wasn't my wife at 6. When did Paul write 1 Corinthians? Oh, you're looking at, 50 AD or so. How long had Matthias been an apostle? He'd been an apostle for some 20 years. And so could it be that Matthias' status as an apostle at the present time that Paul was writing was being used and projected back to a time when he wasn't an apostle? Matthias, who is an apostle now, did he see the resurrected Lord? In fact, what was one of the criteria for being an apostle? He had to go in and out with the apostles from the time of the baptism of John, Jesus baptizing John, and he had to have seen the resurrected Lord, and that was the main job of the apostles, is to eyewitness to the fact of the resurrection. And so could it be that Paul is using prolepsis and taking Matthias' status as an apostle now and projecting it back to a time when he wasn't an apostle? Could be. That's a very legitimate possibility. Is this a contradiction? No, not in any way. But if you've never heard it and you haven't seen an explanation for it, and it gets thrown at you, and before you even have time to think about it, the person then says, and what about this one? And they throw another one at you. And what about this one? And they throw another one at you. And you get hit with 14 of them in 10 minutes, like we did at the debate with Dan Barker, and you aren't prepared for that. So then what do you do? Well, here's what I always say. Take a big, deep breath. Recognize and understand that the Bible has held up under scrutiny for thousands of years. And say, let's study it together. Let's pick our strongest one. You pick your strongest one, I'll give it an answer. Now, after we answer this, here's what I find to be so ironic and dishonest about the way that these go. Okay, Dan Barker used several. Let me work on this. I'm having a little trouble with this. Dan Barker used several that have really quick, legitimate answers. And they've been answered for 150 years. In fact, sometimes even more. Voltaire, the French humanist in 1600, said he had done so much to refute the Bible and to show it was full of errors that 100 years from his death, you would only find a Bible in a museum. That was in 1600 or so, a little after that. Now, there are 90% of the people in the United States of America who have a Bible. 40% of those have 4 or more, and most of them have never read a single sentence from Voltaire. So, obviously, he didn't do as good of a job disproving the inspiration of the Bible as he thought. What I mean to say by that is these challenges have been coming for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, from the earliest attacks on Christianity, these alleged contradictions have been coming, and they've been answered. So, take a big, deep breath and recognize that this is not a new challenge to the Bible. And then say, let's work through these one at a time. And when you do, one of the 70 factual discrepancies that caused that young man to lose his faith, right there in 3 minutes, we just took care of it. And you can pretty much, in 3 minutes, take care of virtually every single one of these. Continue with me. How did Judas die? And this one is ironic. It's ironic because it's probably the most often used alleged contradiction you'll ever see. I was studying with a young man in the county jail in Montgomery several years ago, and he was doing real well, making lots of progress. In fact, eventually we got to get him out of the Montgomery County Jail and baptize him, which, as I understood it, was the first time that anybody had gotten to do that. But we were studying with him, I think, every Tuesday of each week, and for several months it had been going well. And he had prepared a little Bible study schedule that he had, and he'd read the Psalms in the morning, etc. And I showed up one day, and he just had this dejected look, and he said, well, I'm about done studying the Bible. And if you know much about prison work, you understand that there's a pretty strong Muslim influence in the prison systems, and the Muslims delight in pointing out these alleged contradictions. And so he had gotten with some of the people in there who were Muslims, and they had said, well, you know, that Bible's full of errors, and one of those is this. And so he says, yeah, you know, I found out the Bible's got errors and mistakes. And I said, really? I said, I've never seen one. Can you show it to me? He said, yeah, this one right here. And so I'm going to show you the one that basically, if he didn't have an answer for this, he was about to throw in the towel with this singular alleged contradiction. He said, what about this? Judas threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. So according to this verse, if I were to ask you the simple question, how did Judas die? What would you say? Hanged himself. All right. Now this man purchased a field with the wages of iniquity, and falling head first, he burst open in the middle and all his entrails gushed out. If I were to say, according to this verse, how did Judas die? Now, it's kind of a trick question because, you know, I've been doing this a while. And I'm doing to you what the skeptic does to you so often, although you don't even know. You guys pretty readily answered my question without really listening close to the question. No offense to you, because I would have done the exact same thing. But the first thing I asked you for Matthew 27 was, according to Matthew 27, how did Judas die? Now that seems like you get to do that, except for the fact that the text doesn't say that's how he died. It doesn't say anything about him dying. You see, the problem there is lots of times the skeptic adds information in the question that's not necessarily in the text. Has anybody ever been hung and not died? I mean, you got the old Clint Eastwood movie, Hang 'em High, where they hang him up at first and he doesn't die, and then he comes back and, okay, obviously that's a movie. Do you know that hanging in the United States as a mode of suicide is one of the least effective modes in use? Many people who try to hang themselves don't die. So the first thing you could just say is, hey, doesn't say Judas died when he hung himself. Could have still been alive. The second thing that you can say when you look at this is, according to that next passage, does it say that Judas was alive when he fell into the field? Doesn't say that Judas was alive when he fell into the field. Now, here's why I say this one is so very ironic. The irony of this is, if Judas goes and hangs himself and doesn't tell anybody where he goes or what he's doing, what's going to be the natural progression of what happens to him? Okay, it's not like he announced to Peter, hey, I'm going to go hang myself up on this hill, and when I get that done, just make sure you come take my body and bury. Okay, he's going to go hang himself, and as he hangs there, it's going to be in the hot sun in the middle of Palestine for a day, 2, 3. What's going to happen when he hangs himself? His body's going to start to decompose. If you have ever messed with cows or anything like that, and you've been missing a cow and you've gone out into your field 3, 4, 5 days after you haven't seen the cow and you find it, what's the cow look like? Or if you have happened to seen a deer that got hit on the side of the road here, what does that deer look like a day or 2 or 3 after it's been hit? If it doesn't get, if the buzzards and stuff don't get to it pretty soon, it starts to blow up. Well, why is that? Because the gases from the decomposition process start to expand the body and make the skin very brittle, and if anything touches it, there's a video on YouTube that is disgustingly hilarious. And here's what it is. It's a 90-foot whale that the researchers in, it's a Japanese town, decided they were going to move on the back of a huge trailer to a research facility. So it's been on the beach for a couple days. They put it on the back of the trailer. And they're driving it through the center downtown main drag of the town. And they hit a bump. It looks like they stuck a ton of TNT in the well. It literally explodes all over the city street. Well, the decomposition process. Now, if Judas dies while he's hanging there, and hangs there for 2 or 3 days, then maybe that limb breaks. His body that's been decomposing hits that ground, and what's going to be the first thing that happens to it? It's going to burst open, and all his entrails are going to come out. And that's exactly what you would expect to happen. So the irony is, not only is this not a contradiction, but it's exactly what you would expect. And hold on, here's why God wrote it like this. Do you know what the skeptic says when the texts say the exact same thing or almost the exact same thing as the other text? You probably know the skeptics go to that and they say, well, Matthew wrote this right here and Mark just copied him. Well, Mark wrote this right here, Luke just copied him. And so really this is only one witness because it's copied, it's almost word for word. So you don't get to have your cake and eat it too if you're a skeptic. Okay, number one, if you're going to challenge the Bible writers with copying each other and saying, well, that doesn't count as a separate witness, when they say something different, guess what you don't get to say they did? You don't get to say they copied each other. They did not collude together to make this story up. So these stories sound different. So you have to then admit that it's two different witnesses to the event. And then when you point out that it's not a contradiction, well, the skeptical community is now busted because if it's two different witnesses to the event and ultimately 3, 4, 5 different witnesses in various different cases of whatever event it is, and you admitted that you said it was contradictory, but now it's not a contradiction, then you're stuck with multiple witnesses. And you know the more witnesses there are, the stronger case it is, and so you can't say these two copied each other, and you can't say they're contradictory, and so what do you do? Well, I'll tell you what I normally see them do. You know, that may not be a contradiction, but what about this next one? And they just move to the next one. Now, before I go to the next one, I really will say, I'll say now, we can do this as long as you want. There are hundreds of these discrepancies. On our website, we've got probably 650 of them answered. And if any new one comes up, we answer those and we put it out there. I said we can do this all as long as you want. But how many of them do we need to answer before you realize what you're doing? How many of these do you need to say, well, this is your strongest one, and we answer it and say, yeah, but this one's maybe better, and we answer that? How many of them? 3, 5, 10, 20? At what point will you say, okay, that's not a contradiction, and this argument is not what I thought? You see, that is what I would like to get them to nail down before you start the discussion. How many of these do I need to answer for you until you admit maybe you're wrong about this challenge to the inspiration of the Bible? Because we can continue to do this all morning long. 3 days or 3 nights. Maybe you've looked at this one, considered it. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, if you haven't thought through this one, it's going to be a challenge to you. How many days is Jesus supposed to be in the tomb? 3. How many nights? 3. What day was Jesus crucified according to how you normally understand it? Good Friday, Friday night, Saturday night. When did Jesus rise? Sunday morning. Now, quick question. How many times have you read this verse and never even put together that it says 3 nights and you've always thought Jesus was crucified on Friday? So I say that to say this. The reason sometimes these alleged contradictions take us back and almost frighten us a little bit is because we've read this stuff for so long, and some of it we've never really stopped to think about. And so when someone does point that out, that there is a mental challenge to us that we've never even confronted, we do start thinking, oh, what else do I have wrong here? I mean, I've never even thought about that. So then as you start looking at other verses, and Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and after 3 days. Now, in 21st century United States of America, when you say after 3 days, when is that? The 4th day is how I consider the term after 3 days. And then Jesus, God raised up, according to Acts chapter 10:40, on the 3rd day. Okay, so what is all this about? What's happening here? You know, some people have gone so far as to say, well, Jesus was actually crucified on Thursday. That will give you Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday night. I don't think that has much evidence or weight at all, and I would shy away from that response, although to say I know 100% that that's not the case, it'd be difficult. But you don't need to do that. So you could say, well, that's one possibility, that Jesus was crucified on a Thursday, although there's some challenges to that. But it's a remote possibility. But like I said, you're not going to need that. And the reason you're not going to need that is because the writers of the Bible understood the meaning of this very, very clearly. But in our English translations, it just doesn't come across so well. Let me show you what I mean. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who is quoted in the Jerusalem Talmud, who lived about AD 100, he made a statement that at first to you is going to seem odd until we unpack it. A day and a night are an ona, a portion of time, and the portion of an ona is as the whole of it. So he says, you got this section of time, day and a night, and anything that's done in an ona counts as a day and a night. We say, hold on, Kyle, all right, you're seeming like you're stretching that a little bit. Well, here's the thing. If I were to tell you my dog kicked the bucket, what do you understand that to mean in 21st century United States English? That I've obviously got a ninja dog who is remarkably good at karate and can kick a bucket. Is that what you think? No, obviously not. Now, if someone were to say, Kyle Butt said his dog kicked the bucket, and that means his dog has to be able to kick a bucket. If we then show that person that, no, hold on, kicking the bucket means my dog died, and here's where it's used to mean he died, here's where it's used to mean this person died, here's where it's used. So kick the bucket is a figure of speech that means dead, right? It's got nothing to do with the bucket. Now, if we can show that 3 days and 3 nights, on the third day, after 3 days, these are all figures of speech that mean the same thing in Hebrew and Greek, at this time period in history, then you can't say there's a discrepancy or a contradiction. And that's exactly what we can show. When you go to Genesis chapter 7, verses 12 and 17, the Bible talks about the days and the nights, but then in one section it just says days. Well, so what's it saying? An ona, any part of that counts as the whole thing. When you go to Genesis 42, 3 days and 3 nights, then you have the next verse saying, on the third day. Now, here I think is the most remarkable thing. So if you got your Bible, I want you to look at this one. This is where Rehoboam comes to the people. Jeroboam is leading the people, and they say, hey, your dad made our burden very, very heavy, and we want you to lighten it up. And so Rehoboam, Solomon's son, says to the people in 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 5. Look what he says to them. 2 Chronicles chapter, so he said, come back to me after 3 days. So when are they supposed to come to him? After 3 days. Now then, read verse 12. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day. Now notice what the text says. As the king had directed. Well, hold on. In verse 5, I thought it said come after 3 days. That's what the text says. But then they come to him on the third day, and the text says, as the king directed them. So they obviously understood something about on the third day, after 3 days, 3 days and 3 nights. Here's another example of that, one that you might be familiar with from the Bible. Esther says, pray for me day and night for 3 days to Mordecai and the Jews who had gathered there to pray for her situation. So then she goes into the king on the third day. Well, what about that last night? So you think, well, why in the world would anybody count time like that? Seems odd. No. How many minutes of cell phone usage did you have last month? I don't know, 100, 200? No, you didn't. You probably only had, if you had 100 minutes of cell phone usage last month, you probably only had about 82 actual minutes. But do you know how a cell phone company counts a minute? If you talk for 12 seconds, does it put 12 seconds on your bill? It doesn't put 12 seconds. A minute is a portion of time, and any part of a minute is as the whole of it. So if someone were to ask you about your cell phone bill last month, and you said, well, talk 60 minutes. Well, no, you didn't have 60 minutes worth of talk time. Each of those minutes might have only been 12 seconds or 32 seconds or 47 seconds. But it's counted as a minute. And everybody understands a minute is just counted as a minute regardless of whether it's 12 seconds or 52 seconds. Now, let's look at this. Okay, you say, well, that's not a day. Well, we do that often too. Let's say you check in at the Holiday Inn Express. And they say checkout time's at 11. One night is $99. Checkout time's at 11. You wake up about 10:30 and you think, I don't want to check out at 11. I'd rather check out at 2:30. So you do. Check out at 2:30. You go down and they give you a bill. How many nights they charge you for? They can't charge you for 2 nights. You were only there one little portion of time of the next day. And yet you get charged for 2 nights. Why? Because even in the hotel business, a day and a night we don't call it an ona. We call it a night, really. And any portion of that time, you get charged for the whole thing. So, you can't say that this is a contradiction when it's obvious from the original text and the people who are involved in this. After 3 days, on the third day, a day and a night, they all mean the same thing. And here's what they mean. It's very simple. Any part of 3 day and night periods. So, when it says 3 days and 3 nights, here's what it means. Any part of the Friday day and night period, any part of the Saturday day and night period, and any part of the Sunday day and night period. That's not hard. You don't need to get Jesus being crucified on Thursday. You don't need to somehow get 3 actual nights, and you don't have to get after the third day, meaning the 4th day. All you need is a simple understanding of what day and night meant in the Bible. Pray for me day and night. Well, does that mean that if you pray only up until 5 and you don't make it till it gets dark, you haven't prayed for that person day and night? No, it's just a figure of speech. Easy to understand. So, there's what? Third one? Now, I'm belaboring these a little bit to make sure we understand how this is working, but you could really do that in a matter of 3 minutes. So that would take us 9 minutes to answer 3 of these 70 alleged contradictions. Is the time up? Oh, it's been up, hasn't it? Anytime somebody answers that quick, you know the time's been. All right, my bad. I didn't hear a bell, my fault. So, we're finished.